Nuremberg, 1488. In the workshop of a printer named Marcus Ira, a press is rolling. The paper it spits out bears a title that will electrify readers across the three imperial cities. Die Geschichte Dracula weiter. On the title page, a woodcut. A crowned prince with long hair sits at a table, dining. Around him, in a forest of stakes, hang the impaled. Men, women, children, skewered like insects. Beneath the image, a single line. Here begins a cruel and terrifying story of the wild berserker Dracula weiter. It is one of Europe's first mass media sensations. It is propaganda. And it is the birth of a myth that still, 5.5 centuries later, simply refuses to disappear. Vampire, prince, monster. Let me tell you the whole story.
Tick, tick, down the hall. Great tales, call it by name. Great tales, shadows remain. Tick, 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 time keeps its stare. Great tales, something is there.
Welcome back to Great Tales. I'm Chris and I'm glad you're here. Thank you for joining me again. In the last episode I promised we'd take a closer look at a man, a 15th century Romanian prince who took on the Ottoman Sultan, who built a kingdom of stakes, who, as you know now, had almost nothing to do with Bram Stoker's vampire, but everything to do with a historic reality that is almost more unsettling than any folklore. I am talking about Vlad III, Dracula, Vlad Țepeș. In English, Vlad the Impaler. And I have to tell you something right off the bat. This episode might unsettle you, because it's going to get complicated. It would be easy to present you with a sadist who had tens of thousands of people nailed to wooden stakes, and leave it at that. That's the German pamphlet. That's the view of Marcus Ira, 1488. It would also be easy to present you with a Romanian national hero, an unyielding defender of Christendom against the Sultan, a man who enforces the law with an iron fist. That is the view of Fyodor Kurizin, 1486. And that's also the Romania of Ceaușescu in 1976. Both perspectives contain truth, and both contain propaganda. And the only honest answer to the question who was Vlad Țepeș is one that might leave you a little unsatisfied, because somehow it stubbornly refuses to fit into a neat box. Get comfortable, pour yourself something nice. This is going to take a while. By the end, you won't just know the Impaler better, you will also see how a myth is born and why that myth is so successful that it inspires Bram Stoker 400 years later, even though Stoker never read a single sentence about the real man. To understand Vlad, we have to start with his father. In the year 1431, in the city of Nuremberg, the very same city where 50 years later the first hate pamphlets against his son would be printed, a Wallachian prince knelt before Emperor Sigismund. His name was Vlad II. At that point, Sigismund was not only king of Hungary, he was also the Holy Roman Emperor, one of the most powerful men in Europe. And he had a plan. He wanted to weld Eastern Europe together against the advancing Ottoman Empire. To that end, he had founded an order, the Order of the Dragon, Societas Draconistarum in Latin, a brotherhood of knights whose members swore to defend the cross of Christ and the Christian kingdoms against the Turks. And on that day in Nuremberg, Sigismund inducted the Wallachian prince Vlad into that order. From that day on, the man carried an epithet that stuck to him immediately back home. Dracula, in Romanian, Drac. That is the word for dragon. But, and this is the linguistic twist you need to remember, Drac in modern Romanian also means devil. Vlad the Dragon, Vlad the Devil, depending on who's saying it. In that same year, probably in the winter of 1431, in the Transylvanian city of Sighișoara, known in German as Schäßburg, his second-born son comes into the world. He is given his father's name, Vlad. And because he is the son of the dragon, a patronymic soon attaches itself, Dracula, son of the dragon, son of the devil. Vlad III grows up in a world where nothing is certain. His father belongs to the house of Basarab, a dynasty that has been fighting over the Wallachian throne for more than 100 years. Wallachia itself is a buffer state, squeezed between the expanding Ottoman Empire to the south and the Kingdom of Hungary to the north. The prince is not determined by a hereditary succession, but elected by the boyars, the Wallachian land nobility, a group of aristocratic families who lean toward Constantinople or Buda, depending on which way the political wind is blowing. One statistic makes this tangible. In the 50 years after 1418, the Wallachian throne changes hands 12 times. On average, a prince rules for about 2 years before he's murdered, betrayed, or driven into exile. This is the world Vlad III is born into. And at the age of 11, something happens to him that will shape the rest of his life. Hostage of the Sultan. The year is 1442. His father, Vlad II Dracula, has a problem. The Ottoman Sultan Murad II distrusts him. He fears the Wallachian has secretly allied with the Hungarians, which is not entirely untrue. Murad invites Vlad II to a personal meeting at the court of Adrianople, present-day Edirne, and Vlad II makes the mistake of accepting that invitation. He brings his 2 younger sons with him, 11-year-old Vlad and his younger brother Radu, who is about 6 years old at that time. At the gates of Edirne, if Ottoman sources are to be believed, all 3 of them are clapped in chains. Father Vlad is imprisoned in the fortress of Gallipoli. The sons are taken to a series of remote mountain fortresses. Kütahya, Agrigents finally took heart in Anatolia. Later, they are brought to Adrianople. Vlad II is released after about a year, but on one condition. He must swear loyalty to the Sultan, and leave his 2 younger sons behind as collateral. Imagine that. You are 11 years old, you don't speak the language, you don't understand the fate, and you're guarded by men whose job is to keep you alive for as long as your father behaves. The moment he stops paying tribute or forges an alliance with the wrong neighbor, your life and your little brother's life are the first things the Ottomans put on the table. Vlad III lives like this for 6 years, until 1448. 6 years in which he learns excellent Ottoman Turkish, writing, the military arts of the Janissaries, Islamic administrative theory. 6 years in which he also learned that any person can betray any other if the price is right. His younger brother Radu reacts differently to captivity. Radu is handsome, genuinely handsome. Later the sources will call him nothing but Selfrumos, the beautiful. The young Mehmed, the future Sultan Mehmed II, conqueror of Constantinople, is said to have fallen in love with him. Radu converts to Islam. He rises at the court. He becomes an Ottoman courtier. Vlad, on the other hand, becomes someone who despises everything Ottoman. The massacre that started it all. A shock reaches Edirne. Vlad III learns that his father has been beaten to death in a swamp near Bucharest. By his own Bojars, by Wallachians acting under the influence of John Hunyadi, the Hungarian regent. Worse still, his older brother Mircea, who had been governing Wallachia on their father's behalf, was seized by those very same Bojars in the capital, Târgoviște. They burned out his eyes with a red-hot iron, and then they buried him alive. Vlad III is 16 years old on that day, and I believe that much of what you will hear about the next 12 years, the years described in such great detail in the German pamphlets, is rooted directly in this piece of news. The live burial of his own brother with his eyes burned out is not an act of routine medieval killing. This is a theatrically cruel spectacle, and the boy who hears about it will stage his own cruel theater 14 years later. In 1448, the Sultan releases him. With Ottoman backing, Vlad makes his first grab for the Wallachian throne. He rules for exactly 2 months. Then he is driven out, flees to Moldavia to his uncle Bogdan II, and then back to Transylvania. 8 years pass, 8 years of exile, of alliances, of betrayal. And in 1456, at a moment when John Hunyadi, the man who's behind his father's murder, marches against the Turks at Belgrade, Vlad strikes. He marches into Wallachia. His rival Vladislav II is killed in single combat. Some sources say by Vlad's own hand. At roughly 25 years of age, Vlad III becomes voivode, ruler of Wallachia, for the second time. This time, it will not last 2 months, it will last 6 years. And it is in those 6 years that Vlad will turn himself into Vlad Țepeș, Vlad the Impaler. One of his first acts of government is an invitation. He invites the leading Bojar families of Wallachia to an Easter feast in Târgoviște. They come, old men in their fine clothes, with their wives, with their grown sons. There's dining, there's celebration. And at the end of the feast, Vlad rises. He asks his guests how many princely reigns they have survived. Every bourgeois who can name several is, in other words, a political survivor, a man who has already switched allegiances with multiple princesses, a man who was probably involved in the murder of his father and his brother. Vlad resorts to extreme measures. The old ones he has impaled on the spot. The younger ones, those still fit to work, he has clapped in irons and driven 80 kilometers north into the Carpathian Mountains. There, on a cliff nearly 1,000 meters above the Argeș River, stands a half-ruined fortress, Poenari. Here, the men and women, the parents and sons of the Wallachian aristocracy, must rebuild a fortress with their bare hands. They carry stones up the mountain until their fine clothes fall off their bodies in rags. They keep working, naked until they die. What remains of Poenari at the end is Vlad's personal eagle's nests. A new fortress built on the ground bone meal of the families who betrayed his fathers. It is a gesture that is not merely revenge. It is a message to anyone who might ever be tempted to conspire against him. And it is the first of the many theatrically cruel spectacles for which history will later remember him. The Golden Cup. But now you need to pay attention, because the other side of the coin is also true. If you read the Russian sources, and I'll explain shortly how these sources came about, you'll find a small anecdote that is missing from the German pamphlets. In the town center of Târgoviște, at a public fountain, Vlad placed a golden cup. Anyone who was thirsty could use the cup, but had to leave it at the fountain. For 6 years, the sources say, the cup remained untouched. Nobody stole it. This is a legend, of course, but it is symbolically important because it carries the other image. Vlad as the ruler who abolishes crime, who eradicates corruption, who gives the peasants protection from the boyars who had been plundering them for centuries, who, with an iron hand, brings security to a land sinking into chaos. And that too is not merely propaganda. Vlad reorganizes the administration. He overhauls the tax system. He fills the key positions on the princely council not with boyars, but with men from the free peasant class, men who owe him their loyalty and to him alone. He promotes Wallachian trade and curtails the privileges of the Saxon merchants from Transylvania who had dominated the Wallachian markets for centuries. He develops Bucharest into a fortified seat of power. A character from 1459, the first document to mention Bucharest by name, is signed by him, with Vladislaus Dracula. This is not a simple sadist. This is a moderniser, a statesman who imposes a vision of centralized power using the methods of his era. And the terrible method of this era, you need to understand this, is impalement. The stake. Let me pause here for a moment because I need to explain this before we go any further. And it is truly dreadful. Impalement in the 15th century was not an exclusively Romanian speciality. And it was certainly not Vlad's invention. It was a method of execution widely practiced across the Ottoman Empire, the Byzantine sphere and the Balkans. The Ottomans themselves later called Vlad Kazikli Bey, the Impaler Lord. But the word kazik, the stake, was familiar to them from their own penal code. So, to the specifics, how does this work? I will not go into graphic detail, out of respect for you and for the victims. But you need to know this much. There are two methods. The first is the quick one, with a stake that's driven through the chest or back. It leads to death within minutes to hours. The second is the slow one, with an oiled stake inserted vertically, without immediately piercing vital organs. The victim is slowly impaled under their own body weight. It can take days before death comes. Vlad preferred, if the sources are to be believed, the second method. And he developed it into a cruel class system. Boyars were hoisted onto higher stakes than common thieves. Turkish ambassadors, who once refused to remove their turbans in his presence, he had the turbans nailed to their skull with 3 small nails and sent them back to the Sultan like that. If that is true, and it is one of the anecdotes that appears in both the German and Russian sources, then this is not sadism. It is diplomatic communication in the language of the time. A language we rightly find horrifying today, but a language that, in the world of the 15th century, had its own cruel grammar. How many people did Vlad impale? Well, the German pamphlets give figures between 40,000 and 100,000. Modern historians, such as Rado Florescu, Raymond McNally and Mattei Casaccio, estimate the total number of the victims in a realistic range of several tens of thousands across the full 6 years of his second reign. Nobody will ever be able to give an exact number. What is certain, he was not an unusually bloodthirsty ruler by the standards of his time. He was an unusually systematic impaler, and he turned the stake into an instrument of his government. The Saxons, the Turks, and the sack of noses. Now to the political core. Vlad's second reign is a single attempt to hold three fronts at once. The first front is the boyars. As you've heard, he struck a first major blow on Easter Day 1457. Over the course of his reign, further mass executions would follow. The records of his princely council show it. Of all the boyars who served under him, only 2 kept their positions between 1457 and 1461. All others were replaced. Mostly dead, sometimes fled. The second front is the Saxons in Transylvania. The German-speaking merchants of Hermannstadt, today's Sibiu, and Kronstadt, today's Brașov. They had controlled trade across the Carpathian passes for centuries. But they had also, and this is the point, repeatedly supported rival claimants to the Wallachian throne. Whenever a Wallachian prince displeased them, he could find asylum and money for a private army in Brașov. Vlad wants to put an end to that. He bans Saxon merchants from having free access to the Wallachian markets. He forces them to sell their goods at designated border points to the Wallachian middlemen. And when in 1457 the Saxons began harassing Wallachian merchants and impaling them in return, because the Saxons were quite familiar with the method themselves, Vlad answers with punitive expeditions. In 1457, 58, 59 and 60, he rides into Transylvania. He burns Saxon villages. He impales hundreds, in some sources thousands. And it is precisely here in the Transylvanian city chancelleries of Brașov and Sibiu that the reports are written, which later migrate westward and end up in the German pamphlets. This is where Vlad becomes a monster. Not for the Wallachian peasant who sees the golden cup at the fountain and thinks, finally there's order, but for the Saxon cloth merchants whose uncle perishes at a stake in a Wallachian village. The third front is Mehmed II, the Sultan who conquered Constantinople in 1453. The former playmate of brother Radu, the most powerful man in the Eastern Mediterranean. In 1459, Vlad stops paying the annual tribute that Wallachia had to be remitting to the sultans for decades. In 1460, he refuses to hand over young Wallachian men for the Janissary cause. When Mehmed sends envoys to bring him to heel, Vlad simply has the ambassadors impaled. When Mehmed sends a cavalry detachment of 1,000 men to arrest Vlad, Vlad lures them to an ambush, destroys them and impales the survivors. The commander, Hamza Pasha, he has hoisted onto a particularly tall stake. In the winter of 1461 to 1462, Vlad launches into a campaign that pulls no punches. With roughly 6,000 men, he crosses the frozen Danube and burns his way systematically through Ottoman Bulgaria. From the mouth of the Danube on the Black Sea all the way up to Nikopol, nearly 600 kilometers along the river. In a letter to the Hungarian king Matthias Corvinus, dated February 11, 1462, Vlad quantifies his own kill count. I'll translate the original text for you. We killed 23,484 Turks, not counting those we burned in their houses or whose heads were cut off by our soldiers. So now, Your Highness, I have broken the peace with him, the Sultan. 23,848 is a curiously precise number. It appears in the letter because Vlad's soldiers collected the severed noses, some sources say heads, some ears, of the dead in sacks and handed them to Vlad's scribes so that a tally could be kept for the king. Vlad has 2 of these sacks sent to the Pope in Rome and to Matthias Corvinus in Buda as proof, as advertising for the Christian cause. In Rome, they're thrilled. Pope Pius II writes about Vlad in his Commentarii. A Catholic celebration in honor of the Wallachian prince is scheduled. In Constantinople, Sultan Mehmed II is rather less thrilled. The Forest of the Impaled. In the spring of 1462, Mehmed II assembles an army the likes of which are hard to match. The exact numbers are disputed. Contemporary sources speak of 90,000 to 150,000 men. Modern historians consider 60 to 90,000 more plausible. But even the lowest estimate makes it the largest Ottoman military force since the conquest of Constantinople. The message is clear. Mehmed doesn't just want to punish Vlad. He wants to annex Wallachia, once and for all. Vlad can field at most 22 to 30,000 men. He knows an open battle and he loses, so he employs a strategy that today we would call scorched earth. He evacuates the villages along the Ottoman line of march. He burns the harvests. He poisons the wells. He drives the livestock into the forests. When the Ottoman cross the Danube, they find no water, no bread, no peasants. The Turkish chronicler Tursun Bey describes it. The heat was so intense that you could have grilled kebab on the soldiers' chainmail. Horses and mules collapsed. Mehmed marches on regardless, toward Târgoviște, the Wallachian capital. Vlad lets his small army vanish into the forests, from where mounted raiding parties repeatedly ambushed the Ottoman vanguard, a guerrilla tactic that was thoroughly modern 500 years before Tito. On the night of June 16th to 17th in 1462, Vlad plays his greatest card. With several thousand riders, sources vary between 7 and 10,000, he sneaks up on the Ottoman main camp in disguise. His plan? To personally kill Sultan Mehmed. He knows the Ottoman camp layout from his youth. He knows the language. He moves, the sources say, through the Turkish ranks without being recognized. But he finds the wrong tent. He storms a tent fortress containing not the Sultan, but 2 of his viziers. He kills them both, Hamzazadeh and Mehmed Bey, but Mehmed himself escapes. The Ottomans regroup. Vlad pulls back with significantly higher losses on his hands than he had expected. Mehmed marches on toward Târgoviște the next morning. He expects a siege. He expects resistance. He finds something else. The Greek chronicler Laonikos Chalkokondyles, writing only a few years later, describes it like this. I'll translate. The army of the Sultan entered the area of the impalements, which was 17 stadia long and 7 stadia wide. There stood great stakes upon which, it was said, approximately 20,000 men, women and children were impaled, a sight that was presented to the Turks and to the Sultan himself. 17 stadia is roughly 3 kilometers, 7 stadia about 1.5 kilometers. A rectangular field, 4 square kilometers in size, covered with stakes, and on every stake a corpse. The tallest, tradition holds, bore Hamza Pasha, the Ottoman general Vlad had captured a year earlier, at the very top, visible from a great distance. Chalkokondyles reports that even the Sultan, who 3 years earlier had watched his own men sack Constantinople, froze at the sight. Mehmed is said to have declared, and I'm giving you the words in a loose translation since the exact quote does not exist in any single original language, "What can you take from a man capable of this? This land belongs to him." Mehmed does not strike camp, but he does not march on either. He turns his army around. He withdraws to the south. It is, if we follow the Western sources, one of the rare moments in Mehmed's career when he abandons a campaign without achieving his objective. Vlad's psychological warfare had worked. Before we continue, I have a small request. If you're enjoying this episode, please do me a favor and leave a like. And a comment too if you feel like it, because I always love hearing from you. I'd also like to invite you to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. But enough about that and back to the story. The brother. But, and this is a tragic detail that no one saw clearly at the time, Vlad had lost the war. Because Mehmed withdraws, but he leaves someone behind. Radu, Vlad's younger brother. Beautiful Radu, now a grown Ottoman courtier, speaking perfect Turkish, moving flawlessly between worlds. Mehmed installs him as a rival voivode. And Radu has something that Vlad, after 6 years of impalement, no longer possesses: charm, understanding, the ability to talk to the boyars. In the weeks after Mehmed's withdrawal, more and more Wallachian boyars switch to Radu's side. They're exhausted, they're terrified. They have seen that even impaling 20,000 Turks did not permanently drive off the Ottoman army. And they know the Sultan will return if the brother doesn't toe the line. And so they choose the brother's side. Vlad retreats into the Carpathians, hoping for Hungarian help. Matthias Corvinus, the Hungarian king, does indeed march into Transylvania. But when he meets Vlad in Brasov in November 1462, he unexpectedly has him arrested. The official pretext is 3 letters that Matthias' officials have supposedly intercepted. 3 letters in which Vlad allegedly conspired in secret with the Sultan. Most modern historians consider these letters to be forgeries, probably produced by Matthias' own chancellery to provide a political pretext for the arrest. The real reason? Matthias has collected a large sum from the Pope to lead a crusade against the Ottomans. But he has spent the money on other things. He needs a scapegoat in case anyone asks why the crusade never happened. Vlad, freshly betrayed by his own people, is the perfect scapegoat. Vlad is taken to Visegrad, the summer residence of the Hungarian kings on the Danube, northwest of Buda. Here he spends the next several years. Exactly how many is debated amongst historians. Russian sources speak of 12 years, from 1462 to 1474. Florescu and McNally consider 4 years more plausible, from 1462 to about 1466. What is certain? Over time it becomes more of a house arrest than a dungeon. Vlad is given permission to marry a cousin of Matthias, a woman from the house of Shigali. He converts to Catholicism, probably after 1465. A political gesture, not an act of conviction. He has 2 sons. And it is during precisely this period, the 1460s and 1470s, that the German pamphlet we heard at the beginning of this episode begins to take shape. Exactly when the first reports of Vlad's deeds were written down in German is a matter of debate. The most likely theory in current scholarship, advanced by the Romanian French historian Matei Cazacu, amongst others, holds that as early as 1462, immediately after Vlad's arrest, Matthias Corvinus had a collection of anecdotes compiled at his court in Buda, in Latin at first, a catalogue of Vlad's atrocities intended to explain to the European courts why the King of Hungary had thrown his own ally into a dungeon. From this Latin original, a German language version emerges, circulating through monastic scriptoria. A particularly early manuscript is found in the Abbey of St. Gall, dated to 1461 or 1462, which supports Cazacu's thesis. The material existed before it was printed. In Vienna, an itinerant printer named Ulrich Hahn produces the first very rare printed edition in 1463. Then the leap. In 1485, the Lübeck printer Bartholomäus Gothan produces a Low German edition, Van dem quanden Tyranne Dracula wieder, of the wicked tyrant Dracul wieder. And on October 14, 1488, Markus Eyrer in Nuremberg presents his famous edition, 4 leaves, quarto format, with a woodcut that will burn itself into the collective memory of Europe. Vlad, crowned, dining at a table, surrounded by stakes on which the impaled are skewered. Between 1488 and roughly 1568, dozens of reprints and adaptations appear in Nuremberg, Bamberg, Augsburg, Strasbourg, Leipzig and Hamburg. It is one of the first mass media sensations in the history of printing. A true crime bestseller of the late 15th century, if you will. But what exactly is in these pamphlets? They typically consist of about 35 short episodes, each a self-contained anecdote of horror. You've already heard some of them. Here are the key ones. Vlad invites all the beggars and cripples of the land to a great feast in his hall in Târgoviște. He asks them whether they would like to be free forever from the worry of bread and beer. They say yes. He has the doors bolted and the hall set on fire. A servant passed by the forest of stakes and holds his nose because of the stench. Vlad has an especially tall stake erected so that the servers can rise above the stench. 2 monks visit the prince. Vlad leads them through the forest of stakes and asks what they think of it. One of them, in the German version, praises the prince's severity and is allowed to live. The other criticizes him and is immediately impaled. In the Russian version, it is exactly the other way around. The honest, courageous monk survives. The sycophant is impaled. The same story, two moral frameworks. A woman has soon her husband a shirt that is too short. She's impaled for laziness. Turkish ambassadors refuse to remove their turbans. Vlad has the turbans nailed to their skulls with small nails. A peasant appears before the prince in his dirty work clothes. Vlad has him impaled for insulting the prince by not appearing in fine attire. And so on, episode after episode, anecdote after anecdote. It is genre literature, horror fiction of the 15th century, and it sold phenomenally well. The Russian counterpoint. While the German pamphlets travel westward, a different narrative is circulating in the east. In the year 1486, an Orthodox monk named Efrosin at the Kirillo-Belozersky monastery near Belozersk in the far north of Russia copies out a manuscript. The Skazanie or Dracula Voivode, in English, The Tale of Voivode Dracula. It is a collection of 19 anecdotes, similar to those in the German pamphlets, but in many cases with a different morale. Where the German narrator has the monk offer praise, the Russian narrator has him offer criticism. Where the German peasant is impaled for dirty clothes, the Russian peasant is given a lesson about how every person's duty to present themselves with dignity. Where the German version shows Vlad as the bloodthirsty berserker, the Russian version shows him as a stern but just ruler, a man who places the law above everything, even above his own compassion. But who wrote this tale? The most likely theory points to a man named Fyodor Kurizin. He was a diplomat in the service of Ivan III of Moscow. Between 1482 and 1484, he served as envoy of the court of Matthias Corvinus in Buda, the very place where the anti-Vlad material was being curated. But Kurizin read the material against the grain. He reportedly also traveled to Brasov, spoke to the witnesses, even sought out survivors of Vlad's massacres, and returned with a story told in a different language. The language of Orthodox autocracy. For Kurizin, who would soon become one of Ivan III's most important advisors, Vlad was a model of the ruler who does not hesitate to wield his sword when order demands it. A model for the idea that divine authority manifests itself in earthly severity. The historian Matei Kazatu has written that the Skazanie draws a direct line of influence from Vlad through Ivan IV the Terrible, all the way to the Oprichnia, Russia's first secret police. In other words, in Russia, Vlad becomes a role model. In Germany, he becomes a monster. The end. In 1474 or 1475, Vlad's captivity finally comes to an end. Mehmed II is on the advance again. Stephen the Great of Moldavia, a cousin of Vlad's, is putting up a fierce resistance. Matthias Corvinus suddenly needs an anti-Ottoman fighter in Wallachia again. He remembers his house prisoner. In 1476, Vlad marches into Wallachia with a small army. His brother Radu has already died in 1475. A new Ottoman-backed candidate, Basarab Laiota, sits on the throne. In November 1476, Vlad drives him out. It is his third reign. It lasts less than 2 months. In December 1476, possibly not until early January 1477, Vlad is killed in a small battle or ambush south of Bucharest. The circumstances remain disputed to this day. There are at least 3 competing versions. The first version, Vlad and his small escort are ambushed by Ottoman troops and Wallachian Bujars. The bodyguard that Stephen the Great of Moldavia had provided is slaughtered. Vlad himself dies fighting. The second version, transmitted by Fyodor Kurizin, has an almost literary twist. Vlad had, as he so often did, disguised himself as a Turk to scout the enemy lines, and in the confusion was cut down by his own men, killed by his own trick. The third version betrayal by the bourgeois. During the fighting, men from his own escort allegedly stabbed him from behind. The eternal bourgeois who had never forgiven him. What is certain? His head was cut off. It is preserved in a barrel of honey, a common method of preserving corpses for long-distance transport at the time. The head is sent to Constantinople. Sultan Mehmed II, who had turned back before the forest of stakes at Târgoviște 14 years earlier, has the head of his old enemy displayed on a tall stake. On the street known today as Banca la Cadesi in the Karaköy district, as proof that the impaler is finally and truly dead. What happened to the rest of his body is uncertain. Romanian folk tradition holds that monks from the monastery of Snagov, on an island in a lake in the north of Bucharest, found the torso in the swamps and buried it in their church. In 1933, the archaeologist Dino Rossetti attempted to verify this tradition. He opened the alleged grave beneath an unmarked stone in front of the altar. What he found was a few human bones mixed with the jaw bones of Neolithic horses. No inscription, no identification, no definite grave. Other historians believe Vlad was more likely buried at the Comana monastery, which he had founded himself and which lay closer to the battlefield. But no excavation was ever conducted here. The truth is, nobody knows where Vlad III Dracula lies. His head ended up on an Ottoman stake. His body ended up somewhere in the Wallachian swamps. And in both cases, the story of the man is almost poetically perfect. It ends the way it began, with the stake. From Vlad to Dracula. And now we need to close one last arc. The arc that brought us here in the first place. To Dracula, to Bram Stoker. Because here too, a myth persists stubbornly, one that has no historical foundation. I already touched on this in the Strigoi episode. Bram Stoker never set foot in Romania his entire life. His handwritten notes survive. They are held at the Rosenbach Museum in Philadelphia, and they have been systematically analyzed by historians such as Elizabeth Miller and Robert 18 Bezang for decades. The conclusion is unambiguous. From Vlad III, Stoker took exactly one thing: the name. He found the word in the summer of 1890 on holiday in Whitby in a book published in 1820. An account of the principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia by William Wilkinson. Dracula in the Wallachian language means devil. Stoker copies this note into his working papers. Until that point, his vampire had been called Count Vampire. From then on, he is Count Dracula. And that's all there is. No description of Vlad's deeds, no hostage years at the Ottoman court, no forest of stakes, no Easter massacre. Not a single sentence about Vlad appears in Stoker's notes, and not a single one of his character traits migrates into Count Dracula. The identification, Dracula equaling Vlad, is an invention of the late 20th century. It traces back essentially to two American historians of Romanian descent, Radu Florescu and Raymond McNally. In 1972, they published the book In Search of Dracula. They claim that Stoker knew and used Vlad as a historical model. The claim is fascinating. It turns Vlad into a tourist attraction, and it lays the foundation for an entire Romanian Dracula industry. But it is, according to most Stoker scholars today, simply wrong. What Stoker actually used for his vampire, I told you in the last episode. Emily Girard, the Romanian Strigoi folk belief, the folklore. The literary Count Dracula is far more a Strigoi than a Wallachian prince, but the myth lives on. In 1992, Francis Ford Coppola releases his film Bram Stoker's Dracula, in which he cements the identification Vlad equaling Dracula in the film's prologue, complete with Vlad as a Templar, as an Ottoman warrior, as inconsolable widower. With the film, the Florescu mythology enters global pop culture, and since then, it has been impossible to dislodge. One more twist before we can wrap up. Bran Castle in Transylvania, the one the whole world knows as Dracula's castle, the one on the postcards, has practically nothing to do with Vlad. Vlad was probably there only once, at most, and possibly even as a prisoner of the Saxons. His actual residencies were the courts at Târgoviște and Bucharest, and his mountain fortress Poenari, high above the Argeș River. If you ever travel to Romania and want to walk in Vlad's footsteps, go to Poenari and climb the 1,480 steps. Bran is tourism. Poenari is where the man actually lived and ruled. Who's hero? We're almost at the end, but there's one more question I want to leave you with. In Romania, Vlad remains a national hero to this day. There are statues of him in Bucharest and everywhere. He appears on postage stamps as the defender of Christendom. School children learn to see his image as that of a man who stood against Ottoman supremacy and defended his homeland. The image is not entirely undeserved, but it has also been instrumentalized. In December 1976, on the occasion of the 500th anniversary of his death, Nicolae Ceaușescu staged a state commemoration for Vlad. 2 academic biographies were published, both funded by the regime. There were books, paintings, a postage stamp, television broadcasts. Ceaușescu himself is said to have spoken in a speech about Vlad's defense of Wallachian independence. His wife Elena Florescu later recounted, the very same Florescu who had marketed Vlad as Dracula, reportedly whispered to her husband, "A man like you is born only once every 500 years." The parallel was not accidental. Ceaușescu saw in Vlad what he wished to see in himself, an unbending Romanian patriot who bowed neither to Western imperialism nor to the Soviet big brother. A hard ruler who brought the bourgeois, the internal enemies, to heel. Vlad as historical legitimation for Ceaușescu's own dictatorship. I'm telling you this because this is meant to be an honest episode. Every memory of Vlad is always also a political memory. The German Saxons needed him as a berserker to justify their own trade losses. Matthias Corvinus needed him as a traitor to explain his embezzled crusade funds. Fyodor Kurizin needed him as a just despot to legitimize Russian autocracy. Ceaușescu needed him as a national hero to dress communist dictatorship in the robes of national myth. And Florescu, McNally and Hollywood needed him as a vampire to channel blood-hungry tourism toward Bran Castle. What remains of the real man? An 11-year-old boy in an Ottoman fortress, a 25-year-old who holds an Easter feast and impales the murderers of his father and brother, a strategist who erects a forest of 20,000 dead to force the most powerful sultan of his age to turn back, a prisoner who spends 12 years in a Hungarian summer palace and during that time becomes the central figure of Europe's first mass-printed sensation. A man whose head is sent in honey to Constantinople and whose body vanishes forever in the Wallachian swamps. Vlad was a sadist who deployed the stake as a political tool. Vlad was a moderniser who centralized power. Vlad was a defender of Christendom against the Sultan. Vlad was a killer who consigned tens of thousands to the stakes. Vlad was a victim of torture, hostage-taking and betrayal from the age of 11. Vlad was a political architect whose methods rightly horrify us today. All of this is true, but none of this is the whole story. And perhaps that is exactly the lesson Vlad leaves us. That the simple answers, the hero or the berserker, the patriot or the monster, are never enough when you truly want to understand who a person was. That was a hefty chunk of history. Thank you to everyone who stuck with me to the end. Before I let you go into the night, a preview, or rather a question. There is someone else who would fit rather well into this series of the origins of the vampire myth. A woman born in 1560 in near Bátor, Hungary. A noblewoman from one of the most powerful families in the kingdom. Her uncle was King of Poland, her cousin Prince of Transylvania. Her family name echoes through the Carpathians. Báthory. Vlad III died in 1476. Roughly 80 years later, a girl was born into a world still shaped by the German pamphlets and the Russian tales. A world in which Hungarian noble families practiced execution on a scale that would have given Vlad himself pause. A world in which the Carpathian castles did not resist the Ottomans, but offered a stage to those who locked themselves inside. Elizabeth Báthory, the Blood Countess. 650 victims, says one legend. 80 says a count verdict. 0 say some historians today. Truth, myth, politics, just like Vlad, but this time with a woman at the center. And a story that unfolds differently than you might think. If this topic interests you, let me know in the comments. Then her episode will come rather soon. Until then, sleep well. And if you visit a castle in the Carpathians where a sign tells you Dracula was here, remember that most of these signs are simply lying. Leave a subscribe, a like, and a boost if you enjoy this and if you value my work. Thank you. That was Great Tales for today. Stay safe out there in the nights ahead. Take good care of yourselves. I'll be back for you very soon. Yours, Chris.